I intend to sit down with all party leaders in the coming weeks to talk about their priorities, about how we can work together. They will be various and varied conversations, but I can tell you it is not in our plans at all to form any sort of formal coalition, formal or informal coalition.
I've seen minority parliaments play out like this before. I'm saddened because I'm trying to figure out, how do we make this productive? How do we make progress on climate in a minority parliament? How do we make progress on pharmacare? Basically, how do we work together after a very divisive election campaign?
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau faces a new reality in his second mandate. Without a majority, his government will have to rely on opposition parties to pass legislation and advance its agenda. Trudeau is ruling out, as you heard there, a coalition, and instead says he'll work with opposition MPs on a case-by-case basis. So how likely is it that that approach will succeed? David Peterson is a former Liberal Premier of Ontario, and he joins us right now from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Peterson. Wonderful to see you. Thank you for making time.
Hi, delighted to be back. Thank you.
If you could indulge us a little and take a trip back through memory lane, I'm wondering if you can sort of reflect a bit on 1985, when, of course, you didn't win the most seats, but you were able to govern through a confidence accord with Bob Rae's New Democrats. How did that all come about?
Well, that circumstance was particularly unique, as all minority governments are. In that case, we had the 4 less seats in the Conservative. They lost in the House on a confidence motion, and the NDP had half the number of seats we did. They had 25. And so it seemed like a reasonable way to handle the situation and the circumstances. It was, you could say, we did not have a majority. We had a minority. It wasn't a particularly strong minority government in our case. And the opposition, or the third party, had a large number of seats. So that solution accommodated those circumstances. These circumstances are different. Mr. Trudeau has quite a strong minority, and the logical people to sort of support them are the NDP, and they have a few number of seats, and they lost a lot. So I think, I listened to the Prime Minister this afternoon, and I think he's got the right approach to this. He doesn't have to form a formal relationship, but he's got to be very, very sensitive to everybody else in the House. What happens in a minority is the House, the Parliament, the legislature becomes the center of all activity. And it forces people to come back to that Parliament, which you can avoid if you have a majority. But they've got to come back and arbitrate all of their positions, because the opposition can, if they choose, make your life miserable, even if they don't want to defeat you.
And you're referencing there what the Prime Minister said earlier today, which is that he didn't plan on entering into any formal or informal coalition, which lends itself to the idea that they will likely be doing this on a case-by-case basis. Do you think, and you said it was the right decision, do you think that's the correct decision by virtue of the strength of their minority, the sheer number of seats that they have? Like, is it a calculation that you end up making in those situations?
I think it's a reaction to the circumstances. But let me say, I lived through 3 minority governments when I was in Parliament. Bill Davis ran 2 of them. And twice he ran minorities on a case-by-case basis, and he would sensibly tune the legislation, to draw support from one of the opposition parties in order to keep hold of things. But what's really interesting, the crazy glue that really holds a minority government together is a fear of election. And so all the opposition parties will be saying, they say, gee, I don't want to cause an election. I don't want to be seen to cause an election, because the voters tend to punish people that are seen to cause an election. Voters actually want you to get along, and this is kind of a period of forced reasonableness, which is not a bad thing. And that does not necessarily mean this has to be a non-productive session. By the contrary, I think most people look at that 1985 minority that we had, and it was one of the most productive periods of liberal, progressive legislation in the history of Ontario, for sure, and I think other parliaments as well. So this is not bad news for the country. It's going to change the behavior of some of the politicians, but that's not a horrible thing either.
Let me ask you a little bit, taking a step back and just at some of the results that we saw from the election, particularly that there isn't a Liberal elected between Winnipeg and Vancouver. And the Prime Minister in those remarks today was asked many times as well about how the government might go about addressing that. What is your take on or your advice? What would your advice be to the government on how to address that?
Vasi, you've asked me a question of the thing that bothers me the most. Now, I take you back, and it's a long time ago, but I lived through that period of deep instability in this country. The formation of the Bloc and the reaction of the creation of the Reform Party in reaction to that, and the extreme elements in the Reform Party would play off the extreme elements in the separatist movement. And it was a very, very, very unstable period in the history of this country. And it culminated, as you remember, in the death of Meech Lake, and a referendum where we almost lost the country. I see shades of that today. And I think it behooves everyone who cares about this country, including my friends from the West, who I already have been very aggressive in, saying, threatening, implicitly some kind of talking about the alienation and talking about some kind of a catastrophic event, referendums on equalization, things bound to inflame people. I think every single Canadian who's in a position of responsibility has to watch their rhetoric and has to be very, very sensitive. This is very, very unstable when you see this regional politics institutionalized, our team against the other team, and it hasn't been this bad for probably 20 or 30 years. But don't forget, separatism runs under the surface. They're not talking about it today, but it's still implicit in their agenda, and that's where they want to go if the circumstance were ever right. And you find some very extreme and aggrieved elements in the West that think that their case is not being heard. So, what do we do about it? I think that the Prime Minister, who's very sensitive to these matters, has got to have a team and make sure he has the representation from the West to make sure those views are expressed.
Do you mean at the cabinet table? Sorry to interrupt, I just mean at the cabinet.
At least the voices are heard at the cabinet table. There's ways you can put non-elected people in the cabinet, but you've got to make sure you're listening to those voices, and you've got to have extra cooperation with the premiers and the other legitimate voices. So you've got to spend time doing that. Everybody is going to try to advance their own interests in this unstable situation. It's going to take wisdom, generosity, and patience to go through and listen to some of these, shall we say, very excited and extreme voices.
Are they, let me just follow up before I let you go. Is it possible that they are reflective, though, of a true sentiment that does exist, particularly out West? I take your point 100% on the rhetoric and the inflammation of it and being careful around that. But is it possible that they are reflective of something that does truly exist?
Vasily, there's no question that does reflect some of the sentiment, but not all of the sentiment. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important that politician and leadership does, and the media, doesn't reflect just the extremes. The problem in this noisy world that we're in is the loudest and most extreme voices tend to be listened to the most. We see that in the United States, and we see that in a lot of places. And I think we've got to make sure that there are rational and reasonable voices that are being listened to. Look, I know there's extremism everywhere, and I know there's strong opinions everywhere. But at the end of the day, I think most people care about this country and would like to work hard to find the things we have in common. Now, there's going to be divisive issues, like the pipeline. And I think the Prime Minister has no choice but to go ahead on that. And there's going to be a lot of people mad. And there's some issues that are very hard to compromise on because people are so dug in. But I think what we all need is a little humility to say, it's not just my point of view that matters in a country. Other people's points of view matter as well. And even if we don't agree, let's treat them respectfully.
All right, I'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Mr. Peterson. Appreciate your time and insights as always.
Pleasure.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.